Now, I've had a lot of requests to make this video after my What If Andrew Garfield Was in the MCU video, so I guess I'll make this one here. Even though I prefer Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man since I grew up with him, this is going to be a lot harder to take him out of his already established universe, and I'll explain why. Andrew's Spider-Man was more accustomed to modern times, i.e. the tone, the style, the overall feel of those movies would fit right in with Avengers' MCU setting, whereas Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man is goofy, it's cheesy, and the MCU, despite the comedy, takes itself a lot more seriously in the modern era of Hollywood. And because of this, Hollywood has seen a lot more faith in superhero movies being more serious as they know people will eat them up. So this is going to be hard to put Tobey in the MCU, but I'm going to try my best. If it doesn't feel right or doesn't turn out as well as any of my other fanfictions, then well, sorry. Speaking of which, I really like doing these fanfictions on this channel, and you guys seem to love them as well, as these videos generally get the most support. So if you have any what if scenarios or suggestions of any Spider-Man fanfictions or anything like that you'd like me to do, put them in the comments below and I'll see if I can make them. Because these videos take a long ass time to make, and in the short term I'd like to make more scaled down explainer ones as well as the really long and in-depth ones. So put them in the comments below. With that out of the way, let's get straight into today's video. So first we start off, we have to tie in the Tobey Spider-Man to the MCU and explain away where Spider-Man 1, 2 and 3 would have been set in the timeline. Now here's the problem. I tried to do ways in which this could have happened logically, as in after the bomb of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Sony could have decided in the deal with Marvel they'd bring back Tobey Maguire to appear in Civil War, but for the MCU's continuity's sake, that would not make any sense whatsoever, unless the multiverse was a factor. Therefore, I might have to do this a little less logically and say that a lot of the Spider-Man stuff takes place around the same time of Iron Man. In fact, we're going to have to retcon the start of the MCU. The first MCU movie is now chronologically Spider-Man starring Tobey Maguire. Then the next is Iron Man. Not only would this make sense, but there's a deleted scene where Nick Fury spoke about radioactive bug bites, referencing obviously Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, since Kevin Feige, the head of the MCU, worked on those films as well.
As if gamma accidents, radioactive bug bites, and assorted mutants weren't enough. I have to deal with a spoiled brat who doesn't play well with others and wants to keep all his toys to himself.
This was cut due to rights issues, but we're going to throw this in here as the original post-credit scene to Iron Man, so the continuity makes sense and the MCU already acknowledges Spider-Man straight from the off, which brings Peter Parker right into this universe with no explanation. So let's move on to Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 2 will take place after Iron Man 2, as Spider-Man 2 and 3 chronologically take place a few months apart, whereas Spider-Man 1 and 2 take place 2 years apart. So Spider-Man 2 and 3 will take place right after one another, and Spider-Man 3, along with Captain America, will lead into Avengers. Now here's where it gets interesting. Phase 1 is currently Spider-Man, Iron Man, the Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 2, Spider-Man 2, Thor, Spider-Man 3, Captain America the First Avenger, and then the Avengers. Now let's move on to how Tobey would fit into the Avengers. Most of the movie would play out relatively the same, except for there will be some differences. It has been a year or two since the events of Spider-Man 3, and there hasn't been any big villains like Sandman or Venom recently, so Peter hasn't had to do any work as Spider-Man. However, if you're wondering how these events of these movies will be referenced in the MCU, there will be a couple of throwaway lines when the Avengers meet, where Nick Fury will explain that some events, or big events quote unquote, have happened in the past. The world knows of Spider-Man, the world relies on Spider-Man, and we can't ignore that Spider-Man in the Raimi universe originally was this massive figure of hope. Therefore, when we get to the Avengers in this universe, Peter will be trying to focus on his personal life a bit more than being Spider-Man, as he's noticed that other heroes like Iron Man are jumping about nowadays, but New York is almost certainly still Spider-Man's playground. It is revealed that after Harry's death in the events of Spider-Man 3, Peter and MJ have taken a slight break from each other, and their relationship is slightly falling apart after all the trauma that they have been through together in the past 3 movies. This storyline will be similar to the Spider-Man PS4 storyline between Peter and MJ, where they have split up but are still mutual with each other. The movie will play out relatively the same, and we will have Nick Fury assemble the Avengers, Tony and Cap will have their little squabble, Phil will die, and Nick Fury won't actually recruit Peter at the start, even though he knows he exists. Nick will know that Peter would be one of the youngest on the team and respects that, so won't recruit him. Then we reach the Battle of New York, and Loki's army comes through the portal. This is where we will be introduced to Peter in this movie. It'll be quite late in the movie, almost like how it was when Tom Holland's Spider-Man was introduced in Civil War. Peter will see that New York is under attack. He knows that he can't ignore it. We will get a scene when we get introduced to Peter where Aunt May and Peter will be talking about MJ and everything that has happened in between Spider-Man 3 and here, just catching us up with this character. And then we will get a scene which could be funny, and it could be a little gag between Peter and Mr. Dickovich, telling him he needs to pay rent or something, as Peter swings out of his apartment to go and save the day. Peter will start fighting the T'Chari and start questioning what they are before coming into contact with the Avengers. There will be a small exchange in dialogue where Spider-Man and the Avengers introduce themselves to each other, and Tony will say that he has heard of him and that Nick mentioned him a couple of times in the past. Peter will be confused, but will tell them that he is here to help. Spider-Man will help the Avengers take down the army and Loki, and he'll also be a part of the group shot in Avengers as well. The movie will end and Tony and Cap and the rest of the team will go back to doing what they were doing. There will be a scene with Nick and Peter though, where Nick reveals he knows who he is and Peter is caught off guard first. Nick says that he knows everything about Peter and he knows that he's just a kid and that's why he didn't call him up to help in the first place. He says he knows he has his whole life ahead of him, but now Nick will offer him a place to be on the Avengers. Peter will say no, in that he needs to focus on his personal life for a little while. Peter needs to deal with everything after Harry's death, and he needs to focus on making sure that he doesn't lose MJ. This means that going forward in the MCU, Peter will be reflecting on Harry's death and his relationship with MJ and everything that happened there. So then when we get to Phase 2, this will be an interesting one. Spider-Man was very prominent in the MCU when it came to Phase 1, so in Phase 2, he won't be as prominent and he'll be quite separate from the rest of the Avengers and the bigger world. It becomes clear to us as an audience at this point that Peter, over the course from the end of Spider-Man 3 and through to the end of Avengers, has clearly been in an awkward position with people like MJ in his life and has slowly started to become more distant after the death of his best friend Harry Osborn. So the start of this movie will take place around a month after the events of Avengers, and Spider-Man 4 will explore and continue the story of Peter Parker and directed by none other than Sam Raimi. Now, I originally made a video explaining what Spider-Man 4 would be like. However, in that video I was trying to accommodate to the Raimi vibe as much as I humanly could. However, with this Spider-Man in the MCU now, doing that will be really hard, so I'm going to try and just stick to the main story. But since it isn't a separate universe anymore, keep in mind that Spider-Man wouldn't generally feel like a Raimi movie anymore. We start our story with Peter Parker swinging around the city peacefully. The beautiful score by Christopher Young will set in as Spider-Man swings through the city. The slowness will represent how alone he has become to feel. The slow shots, the camera movements, everything. It's ironic he is in a universe full of superheroes now yet feels so alone. Harry's death really took a toll on Peter and MJ in this universe, but Peter swore to himself that he won't let her slip away like he did Harry, which eventually led to his death. Peter is about to go to class when he sees a crime going down. Spider-Man swings down and deals with the crime. It was Bruce Campbell as Mysterio causing havoc, which will be a little reference to the original plans for Spider-Man 4. We then cut to Peter in class with Dr. Curtis Connors, and yes, this version of Spider-Man 4, the Lizard will be the main villain, and you'll see why. It fits perfectly into the story. And yes, before anyone says that the Vulture was meant to be the main villain of Spider-Man 4, I very much know. This is simply a fanfiction. I think that the Lizard works best here, especially since Dr. Connors has been set up for the last 2 movies in this universe. We'll then get a scene with Peter and Dr. Connors, and ever since the end of the 3rd one, their relationship has improved quite a bit, and they have grown quite close to each other. Dr. Connors has almost become a mentor to Peter in his life. This scene will be used to represent their friendship and set up that these two will know each other really well. Dr. Connors will express his knowledge and moral compass to Peter, showing that he is a good person and that his intentions are pure, really cementing that this guy will be a sympathetic villain and someone we can relate to as an audience. After a couple more filler scenes, getting reintroduced to characters such as J. Jonah Jameson, where we will see Peter struggling to make ends meet again, Mr. Dickovich, who is actually sticking up for Peter, but is still asking for rent, except for this time he's more forgiving to Peter, and really shows their relationship growth over the past couple of movies, and then finally Aunt May, who is kind and caring as ever. We will actually get a scene with Aunt May similar to one we got at the start of Spider-Man 3, where Peter says that he's going to ask MJ to marry him. However, this scene will be a complete parallel reflection of that scene, as this time Peter goes to ask Aunt May how he can save his relationship with MJ, mirroring Spider-Man 3. He says that after Harry's death he feels like things are falling apart with them two, and that they haven't spoke in a while, and he's stressing, and with every passing moment that he doesn't do anything about it, he has the fear that he could lose her forever. And after Harry, Peter can't do that again. Aunt May gives into her giddy optimism and tells Peter that if he really wants what he wants, he is to focus and make it right. If it's meant to be, it's meant to be, says Aunt May, but you have to learn to let the people you love go eventually, which is a callback to the second film, a strong focus on what I want. However, Peter at first, in his mind, will take this quite literally and think that this means at death, just like what happened to Harry. Due to this mindset, Peter will try and make things right with MJ ASAP. We then get a scene with Peter where he gives a call to MJ, and it's kinda awkward. MJ doesn't really know how to act with Peter. She explains that after Harry's death, she has had to try and make things right for herself, and focus on herself as her career as an actress, and simply she hasn't had the time for Peter. Peter says that he's just trying to make things right. MJ says that she can't do this right now and puts down the phone. This is understandable after the events of Spider-Man 3, where everything was kicking off quite literally. MJ just needs some downtime. We then get another scene with Dr. Connors and Peter. Peter expresses his problem to Dr. Connors about MJ as they have grown close, and talk about personal things now. Peter says that he's been beating around the bush with MJ, but he just wants to tell her that he loves her and he just wants to put everything right. Doc says just go for it, because what any other chance are you going to have in life? This expresses through the Doc that his moral code is just to take every opportunity you have, because you might not have another one. With this, he explains he's looked into biological science and the regrowth of his arm. He wants to make his arm back so he can finally be a normal father to his son, but he can't find out how to do it. He wants to be able to be the father that his father never was to him, adding layers to Dr. Connors' character, and the only way to do that is to regrow his arm, and this is his only chance because his son will grow up eventually. This sets up Dr. Connors' arc and his character going forward in this movie after this conversation with Peter. This will then lead into a montage of Peter and Dr. Connors working together for hours as friends to try and figure out the formula, showing the smart side of Peter Parker again and his willingness to help anyone, not just as Spider-Man, but as Peter as well. They choose to use a cross-species genetics and lizard DNA, as lizards can regrow back limbs. Dr. Connors falls asleep though, and Peter is still working. Peter uncovers the formula equation that they need, and he celebrates. However, it's been a long night, so decides to leave it with Dr. Connors and go home. After a small interaction with Mr. Dickovich, Peter decides to call MJ again to ask about the other night, after what Connors told him. MJ asks, what does he want? Peter says that I know she's trying to focus on herself, but Peter says that he can figure that out with her. They can figure it out together. Whatever is going on, they can do it together. They were meant to be a team. They were meant to be the dream team. Peter says that he loves her. MJ says that sometimes you just gotta move on. Peter isn't having any of it and breaks down crying the same night. Then Connors wakes up in the middle of the night to find the lizard equation. He celebrates and says thank you, Peter. He uses the equation on a formula and injects the serum into himself without any hesitation. We cut back to Peter, who is in his apartment. He is staring out of the window. He's looking for answers, but he's conflicted. He doesn't know which way to go. This scene will give the movie time to breathe before the pacing starts to pick up again. It'll be a slow scene. Then Peter will get the news that a giant lizard-like creature is on the loose. Spider-Man swings out and fights the lizard. However, the lizard will escape. Spider-Man wonders what the hell was that and needs to figure out where it went, because that thing could hurt other people. Luckily, it didn't get much media attention. Peter is now trying to figure out where it went. Peter goes to Dr. Connors' class to see if he's in there in the morning to ask for help on how he would track something like that. Obviously, Peter still thinks of Dr. Connors as that mentor figure. He goes to him for a lot of advice, especially when it's science related. The excuse he was going to go with would be something along the lines of he needed to catch photos for the Bugle. However, Connors isn't there, which is really weird for Peter because Connors is always at his lab. Connors is actually in a sewer and he transforms back from the lizard. He exclaims that it almost worked, he just needs to dumb the serum enough so he doesn't transform and he can grow his arm back. He's becoming obsessed. Connors breaks down because he almost had it. He needs to not give up. Connors will not let this opportunity slip from his grasp to become a normal father to his son. We then get a scene with Dr. Connor's wife and son, who haven't seen him in days and are worried about him. This will show that his family, the ones that Connors is trying to impress, already care about him even though he doesn't have another arm. This will show the affection and how much Connors cares about the people around him, really expanding upon his character and the type of person that Connors is. He tweaks the formula and he calls Peter to come in. Peter meets Dr. Connors, but Connors seems jittery and off, almost psychotic, like he hasn't had a lot of sleep. He says he's perfected the formula and it'll work. He's just made some adjustments to the formula that Peter gave him. Remember, at this point, Peter doesn't know that Dr. Connors is the Lizard, and for all he knows, Dr. Connors and the Lizard are two different people. Then he injects it straight in front of Peter. Peter is cautious and thinks something suspect is going on. As the tension builds, the serum is successful. It grows back Dr. Connors' arm successfully. And then they start celebrating, and Connors says the first thing he's going to do when he goes home is to pick up his son. It worked. It actually worked. Success. And this proves Connors' willingness to never give up. However, he then goes home and picks up his son, but then he transforms into the Lizard again, but this time later, showing that Connors hadn't fully worked out the serum quite yet. His wife and son are scared to death, whilst Connors, as the Lizard, was tearing things up, and Spider-Man swoops in. They fight, and Peter figures that Connors is the Lizard he fought before, and Peter is in disbelief. How could Connors let this happen to himself? He was a good man. He is a good man. Peter gets his wife and son to safety and goes after the Lizard, but the Lizard has escaped away into the night once again. We then get a scene where Peter has the pictures of the fight, but he decides not to show them to the Bugle because Dr. Connors is his friend and he doesn't want to expose him. JJ then says he's fired. This scene will show Peter's moral compass and how much he cares about Dr. Connors and his family, showing that he'd never trade money for the credibility of his friends, showing the type of person that Peter is, even in the dullest of times. However, in this downtime, Peter goes back to Aunt May again, worrying about MJ, and tells her how everything is so awkward and she's blunt with him. Aunt May says that maybe it's not meant to be. You have to learn to let go of the people you love, because sometimes in life when you grow up, your first love is never your last love. Peter takes this advice on board and thinks long and hard about it. Therefore, Peter has learned. He has learned that he has to move on. He has learned to let go of Mary Jane. It's going to be hard for him, but he has to. This scene will also be another breather scene before the final climactic ending of this movie. There is one last thing left to do though. He has to stop the Lizard, and he has to bring Connors home. Peter then tracks down the Lizard. Spider-Man and the Lizard fight. It's an epic and brutal fight, but then the DNA eventually wears off, and Dr. Connors transforms back. In the fight, Peter's mask is ripped off, and Connors says that he must try again. He can't fail his son like that. Peter and Dr. Connors, as friends, have a heart-to-heart as Peter can now see Connors, and Connors can now see Peter as Spider-Man. Peter says that you must learn to let go. He says that he's a great father anyway. They wouldn't have you any different, echoing the message that Aunt May taught him earlier on to Connors. These two will have paralleling arcs. Dr. Connors asks if Peter is going to turn him in, and Peter says no. The final scene is Connors returning home to his family safe in one piece, having completing his arc with narration from Peter, like the end of most Raimi movies, stating that moving on is a natural part of life. You have to learn to let go of the ones you love the most, if not through death, but through growth. And then we end the movie with one final epic swing sequence from Spider-Man and the original OG score by Danny Elfman. So at the end of the last Spider-Man movie, which was Spider-Man 4 in the MCU, we have learned that Peter has learned to move on from MJ after the events of Spider-Man 3, and Peter is a changed man. We then move forward past Avengers Age of Ultron, which will be exactly the same as the movie was originally and without Spider-Man. And now we get to the start of Phase 3, which is where things really start to change. For the most part, I want to keep the Civil War story the same, but now that we have Spider-Man in the mix as an already established hero in this universe, we can play off this fact a lot for story elements here as well. In the comic book Civil War, the story was heavily focused around Spider-Man and his identity, and with him switching teams halfway through. I want to create a similar sort of effect here to an extent. So the Civil War story will start, and it'll be relatively the same with Tony learning about the woman's son who died in Sokovia, and then the Sokovia Accords will be brought around, and that every superhero or Avenger will turn themselves into the government, and will be under government jurisdiction on when to be employed to battle where they see fit. So obviously this will play out the same. Tony will side with the government and Cap won't, except there's one twist. Any superhero that signs the contract also has to reveal their identity if they haven't done so already. So at this point that would affect obviously Bucky, as he's currently on the run as the Winter Soldier, and this would affect none other than Peter Parker because he is Spider-Man. Now I must clarify, all of the Bucky and Cap stuff will happen in this movie, I just won't be touching on it as much, as I'm going to be focusing on where Spider-Man affects the story and focus on his side of the story for this video. So this will affect Peter the most out of everyone though, as his secret identity is a big part of what makes him Spider-Man. Not only does Peter Parker represent the everyman and woman, but Peter keeps it to himself for himself. That way criminals and whoever can't hurt the people he loves around him. Throughout the first act of the movie, where all the Avengers are discussing and arguing over what they will do about the situation, Peter will be in a conflict within himself. You see, Peter can't reveal his identity to the public and to the government because of the risk of his enemies knowing who he is, like Venom, Doc Ock, or whoever might come in the future. But at the same time, if he doesn't sign the Accords, he has to retire as Spider-Man, which would then be going against the whole "with great power comes great responsibility" line, which Peter stands by so greatly. The very line said by his late uncle that fuels Peter's need to get out of bed every morning and go and save people and help every single day. You see, Uncle Ben will be a huge influence in this movie, and this is starting here. But with the new Accords, he's stuck. He reveals his identity or he can't be Spider-Man. It's either one or the other. Peter realizes it boils down to two things. Does he just want to keep the ones he loves safe, or does he want to carry on protecting the people of the city like he's been doing? After all, through Spider-Man 1, 2, and 3, the city has always been on Peter's side and supported him. He can't turn his back on everyone now. So then this internal conflict with Spider-Man will turn him more towards Tony's side. A couple of scenes will go by and we will have a scene with Peter and Tony. Tony is going to ask Peter if he's okay with doing this, and Peter says that he's doing the right thing. And then we get a scene where the Accords are going down, and this time, as people sign them, Spider-Man will swing in for a big reveal. He will stand on the stage as T'Chaka will hand Spider-Man the microphone, and Spider-Man says that he has a very big announcement to make. He says that in all of this, he's going to do the right thing, and he's going to carry on serving the people of New York and sign the Accords. But first, he needs to let the world know who Spider-Man is. But before Peter can take off the mask, the explosion goes off in the building, and T'Chaka, like in the original movie, will die. Peter's costume will be all torn up, and T'Challa will be pissed. This time, when Cap chases down Bucky in the next scene along with Black Panther, Spider-Man will be on the scene too with them. You see, this will be a direct callback to the comics where Peter takes off his mask to reveal to the world who he really is. But I'm not actually going to do that here, as I think the world knowing who Spider-Man is takes away from the character. The rest of the movie plays out the same, and all the Cap and Bucky stuff happens at the same time. They are on the run and now labelled as war criminals. Team Tony, like in the actual movie, are tasked with bringing them in and taking them down. This now obviously includes Spider-Man. There will be a scene with Peter and Tony before they go to the airport with Black Widow. Peter will say we're gonna bring them in, but says for Tony to promise that no one will get hurt, and Tony will agree. So with Cap and all that on the run, there is no time for Peter to reveal his identity and get into all of the political stuff, as there are bigger things here at stake. So then we get to the airport fight scene where Team Tony encounter Cap. Cap is obviously trying to convince Tony about who the real villain is, Zemo, and how he's been behind all of this. In the battle, however, Cap will encounter Spider-Man. They will have their little dialogue exchange, except it's different. Because Peter is way more experienced, and if not the most experienced superhero there, Cap will be way more understanding with Spider-Man. Cap says that if he sides with Tony, his identity will be revealed, and that is something that Team Cap is fighting to protect, obviously when it comes to the whole Bucky situation. Cap also explains to Peter how everything is really political, and that the government would control Spider-Man. His life as Peter Parker would be no longer. He wouldn't be fighting for the everyman, he'd be fighting for the rich above. This resonates with Peter. You see, Peter being on Team Tony undoes most of what Spider-Man stands for. Even though there is that great responsibility of being Spider-Man, if he sides with the government and fights wherever they see fit, then he becomes less relatable as a person, as a character. Peter then isn't the everyman. One crucial thing about Spider-Man is his relatability and the fact that anyone could be under the mask. That's what makes him so special, and that's what will be taken away if his secret identity is revealed. Siding with the government would reveal who he is, and Peter was only concerned about the people he loves. But now Peter's learning curve starts here. It wouldn't just affect the people he loves, but everyone who has ever looked up to Spider-Man. All those people that cheered him on as he saved the city countless times. He has to think about them as
as well. Them knowing who Peter is will take away from the mystery, it'll take away from the excitement, it'll take away from the everyman aspect. Peter resonates on this for a moment before fighting Cap again. It's at the back of his mind, but he hasn't fully switched sides yet. And then instead of War Machine getting hurt in the fight, it'll be Falcon that gets hurt really bad. It's someone on Team Cap's side. Peter then realizes, and this sets him off, he didn't want anyone to get hurt. Tony lied. Peter has a go at Tony, and Tony says that he didn't want this either, but Ross was going to cancel all of them if they didn't bring them in soon. Peter says that Tony is unbelievable and realizes now what Cap told him. It's just all a political game. The ship takes off with Cap and Bucky, and Spider-Man sneaks on the bottom of it, latching onto the side of the plane. Now the reason why Spider-Man would show up at the final battle is because, like Iron Man and Cap, he is a big player in this universe, much bigger than Tom was at this point, because obviously he was the first hero in the universe chronologically. Then obviously Iron Man will show up to the scene. There will be an intense scene where Peter and Cap and Bucky meet, and Peter will say he's on their side and he just wants the fighting to stop, and he thought about what Cap said. Then Tony will show up on the scene and they will all come to a truce, just like in the original movie. Then Tony will find out that Bucky was the one who killed his parents, and it all kicks off again. Tony will fight Cap and Bucky, but Spider-Man won't fight on either side necessarily. Spider-Man in this story is the middle ground. He sides with Cap, but understands Tony at this point too, because Bucky killed Tony's parents, which, would you know, is similar to how Uncle Ben died for Peter. So Peter would level with Tony and understand his anger, because if you remember back to Spider-Man 1, Peter was exactly the same. So instead of fighting on either side, Peter will try and stop the conflict and try and convince Tony that there's a bigger picture, but it won't work. Peter will get trapped somewhere for a while when Tony, Cap and Bucky will have their final fight like in the real movie, just to give those guys their moment. Then Cap will walk off with Bucky and will drop the shield. We will then get a scene where Peter encounters T'Challa, and they will have a little dialogue exchange before they both stop Zemo in this version together and take him away. And then the rest plays out the same. T'Challa takes Bucky to Wakanda with Cap, Peter goes back to being Spider-Man, and Tony never gets him to sign the Accords. So coming off the back end of Civil War, the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man has just learned that revealing his identity would have been a mistake, but due to the new Accords, that means he can't be Spider-Man. However, Peter Parker will still do everything in his power to fight for the people and for the everyman. So when going into Infinity War and the final chapter of this story, and after coming off the back of Spider-Man 4 as well, Peter Parker was left with no personal consequence. The only person really left in his life now, apart from the other superheroes, is Aunt May. But then I realized the Infinity War story works so well for this version of Peter Parker. His arc going into this movie is that Civil War has made him realize that no matter what, he has to fight for the everyman, because that's the type of person that Spider-Man represents. Throughout phase 1 and 2, Spider-Man has been this figure of hope, like in Spider-Man 3 when the city cheered him on when he fought Venom and Sandman. It just shows how much people love him, and it's because he's relatable. He's not a billionaire, he's just a man in a costume fighting for what's right, and will help you no matter what. So that's when it comes to Infinity War just after Civil War, the stakes are really high, because everything is on a bigger scale, a scale like we have never seen before, and this will scare Peter. Now more than ever, he will want to protect the city, New York, the people, his people. It's like the city that Sam Raimi set up in his original trilogy was a character of its own, and they have a connection to Spider-Man. And now it's stronger than ever, because throughout Civil War, Spider-Man was the only one who really thought about them. This creates and strengthens that personal connection Spider-Man and the city have, and now that Infinity War is here, and now that Thanos is here, this will scare Peter. Peter is frightened. He's been able to defeat every villain that's threatened the city and protected the city he holds so close to him, but this is big. This won't just affect his city, but the entire universe, and now puts more on Peter's shoulders. He's got to save everyone, and this notion will scare him. Bruce Banner will come down to Earth, and the movie will play out the same, with Thor getting his ass handed to him by Thanos. Doctor Strange meets up with Tony, and they have their conversation, and Peter is integrated into the battle the same way that Tom Holland's Spider-Man was, and he goes and helps out. There will be a little awkward interaction between Tony and Peter because of what happened at the end of Civil War, but they decide that to do what's right, they have to work together. So the movie plays out the exact same, except it's Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker that goes to space with the Avengers. Tony says that if Peter is to go to space, he's going to need some assistance, and says he was working on this during the whole Civil War debacle, but because the Accords were never signed properly, he didn't give it to him. Tony says that this was the suit he was going to wear if the government had approved him, and he went ahead as Spider-Man and worked for the government, and then Tony presses a button similar to the original scene and Peter gets an Iron Spider suit, but this time it's the OG Iron Spider suit from the comics, the dark red and gold suit. So Tony and the team go to space and everything plays out the exact same. They go to Titan and encounter Thanos. They fight Thanos and they inevitably lose against him as well. And then Thanos snaps in Wakanda and everyone is snapped away apart from Peter, Tony, and Nebula. Similar to What If My Andrew Garfield was in the MCU video, Tobey does not get snapped away. This is because, like Andrew, he is older and much more mature as Spider-Man and is one of the key players. And in this timeline, Tobey is one of the OG, if not the OG MCU member, because he was technically the first MCU movie in this timeline, and he has been a major influence on the Avengers and the Civil War storyline, meaning that he will stay alive as one of the OG members. And plus, his character arc warrants this. This will be very similar to my Andrew video, but it still makes sense. Peter would have failed. That fear that he couldn't save the city, and failed because him and the Avengers had the weight of the entire universe on their shoulders, and they lost. Moving through to Endgame, Peter will reflect on this. Captain Marvel will rescue them like in the actual movie, and they'll go back to Earth. And we will get a scene where Peter explores New York, and it's empty. There's dread. Not only that, but Aunt May has been taken by the snap too. The only one he loved to protect along with the city he adored so much has been ripped from him. Peter Parker had lost. We skip 5 years in Endgame, and everything is the same before, except Peter Parker is still Spider-Man. My Andrew Garfield video, he gave up being Spider-Man, but this time, he is still Spider-Man. Tobey in this timeline will be so desperate to get everyone back. Peter hasn't changed one bit in 5 years and is so desperate to get everyone back. He latches off the thought that he has to bring everyone back. There has to be a way. This giddy optimism leads him to insanity, and Peter is Spider-Man 24/7 because he has nothing else better to do with his life. The city's gone, Aunt May's gone, he doesn't speak to MJ anymore, he doesn't even know if she's still alive. The slightest inconvenience and Peter as Spider-Man is on the scene. At this point he's become more of a Batman type figure, if anything. So the OG Thanos from Infinity War is dead, and it's 5 years later. The Avengers found out a way to time travel, so are onto it. Black Widow goes to track down Hawkeye, and Tony will do the same, but he will go and track down Spider-Man to get as much help as they possibly can. Peter and Tony will have a moment where Peter says that they could have done more to save everyone, and Tony says there was nothing more we could have done, but we found a way. So Peter returns to the base. So just like my Andrew series, Peter will go with Tony and Cap to New York, as that is his home. Peter will have a moment in New York where he reminisces and remembers what it used to be. This will be a little breather moment for the film. They will all get the stones and return, and Black Widow will die as she does in the film, and then Hulk will snap everyone back. The other Thanos will come and they will have an epic final battle. Spider-Man and the Avengers will have their final battle, and then Tony will snap just like in the actual movie. Now some of you may be wanting Tobey to snap, and while he was the OG in this universe, Spider-Man isn't actually an Avenger. He's more of a solo character, and he wasn't really in Age of Ultron either. And yes, his arc would work here if he were to bring half the universe back, including everyone that died in New York, because he became so obsessed with wanting to protect the city. However, it still feels more right and more in Tony's character to do it. I had a long hard think about this, but if Tony does it, then there is still a satisfying way to pay off Peter's arc as well. After Tony's funeral, we'll get our moments with all the Avengers. We get the Cap moment, the Hulk moment, the Thor and the Guardians moment, and then we will get the Peter moment. He will visit Aunt May and hug her, and it'll be a little nice reunion scene. It's also revealed that Peter has now become a teacher of science at the Empire State University in his little older state. Obviously he was alive through the snap, that means he's 5 years older than everyone else, and he's obviously aged throughout the MCU as well, as he was one of the original heroes. You see, Peter's arc ends here. It was about him learning that he doesn't always have to be Spider-Man 24/7 to help people. He can help the city and the people of it in other ways. He helps the little guy as Peter Parker as a teacher, and he will help the rest as Spider-Man, and thus he's learned. He will have his triumphant final swing through the city as Spider-Man as he's back, similar to the final swings in the actual movies. And that is it. What if Tobey Maguire was in the MCU? If you did enjoy the series, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you are new, make sure to comment down below what you thought and if you enjoyed, and more video suggestions, more fanfictions in the description below. I'll take all the suggestions because I'll be making lots of them coming in the future. And with that being said, Sinister 6 is next. That's going to be the next fanfiction. You already know. Hashtag Spider-Verse hype. Let's go in the comments right now. With that being said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.